Hello there and welcome to the Mobile Academy. And if you want to become a job ready Flutter developer, make sure to check out the courses on my website mobileacademy.io. Here you will find all of the courses related to the Flutter development. You will find the professional course as well as the basic course related to the Flutter. You can also find some of the free courses over here if you want to just go and try it out, or if you are just a beginner on the Flutter and then the React Native, you can also find the free course over here. And if you would like to be a full stack developer, we also have the course related to the full stack developer, related to the Node.js, Express, MongoDB, as well as the Flutter over here. And if you would like to join the Flutter bootcamp, there is also a bootcamp course over here. So make sure to go and check out the course over here. There are free and then the paid course. And if you want to be a job ready Flutter developer, this is the course that you want to take. So see you guys on the next lesson. Till then, have a great day. Now let us try to learn about the recommended app architecture from the Android documentation over here. We are not building the Android application, we are building the Flutter application, but we will be using this particular recommended app architecture for our application. And since we have a really small app and we are not going to overcomplicate it with other stuff over here, so let's just go and see some of the recommendations that Android has provided for our application, and we are going to make use of this particular app architecture. And the first one we will see over here is the UI layer, and then the domain layer, and then the data layer. So domain layer, they have mentioned it as optional. So let us go and see what actually is the UI layer over here. So if you read their documentation, the UI layer that displays the application data on their screen. So whatever data we get from our data layer, we are going to display it on our UI layer. And then they have the data layer that contains the business logic of your app and expose the application data. So all of our business logic will reside over here in the data layer, and it will expose to our local database or to our remote API within this particular data layer over here. And we can also add the optional layer, which is of the domain layer, to simplify and reuse some interaction between the UI and then the data layer. So you can add this particular domain layer if you want to create some reusable, like the classes, or you can create the model file or the use cases in this particular domain layer. And let's go down over here. Now this is the modern app architecture over here, and you can read some of this. So a reactive and then the layered architecture. So basically this is a layered architecture. So you have the UI layer, domain layer, and then the data layer, and we also call this one as the layer architecture in the architectural design over here. And let's go to the unidirectional data flow, or the UDF over here. And this is basically the unidirectional of the data flow in all layer of the app. So we can have a two type over here, one each of the data or the state, and next one each of your the event. So if you go on to the top, there is a documentation regarding that one. So unidirectional data flow over here, and we should always have a single source of truth principle. So make sure to go and read about this. I'm not going to cover in this particular lesson over here. Single source of truth over here, it's often used in our guide with the unidirectional data flow pattern. And in the UDF, or the unidirectional data flow, state flows only in one direction, and event that modifies the data flow in the opposite direction. So state is the flows in one direction, and event that flows on the opposite direction. And in Android, so basically you can see in Android, state or the data usually flows from the higher scope type of the hierarchy to the lower scope one, and event are usually triggered from the lower scope type until they reach the single source of the truth for the corresponding data type. So for example, application data usually flows from the data source to the UI, and then the user events such as the button press flows from the UI to the single source of truth, where the application data is modified and exported to the immutable type over here. So this pattern guarantees that the data consistency and is less prone to the error and easier to debug and bring all the benefit of the single source of truth pattern. So this is one of the pattern, architectural design pattern. So make sure to go and read the documentation over here. That basically the single source of truth has a two step one is of the state or the data that flows in the one direction, and then the event that flows in the one direction. So the data will flow from the data layer to the UI layer, and then the event will flow from the from our UI layer to the single source of truth, which will be of our data layer. Will configure our API or the local data source over here. So both of the unidirectional data flow event, whenever user clicks on that particular button or users open a page, so that is going to create some events, right? So that's going to call some of the functionality in the domain layer and as well as in the data layer until it reaches the single source of the truth. And once we have the data over here, we are going to send it back to our from data layer to the domain layer and from domain layer to the UI layer. Finally, then it is displayed on to the user screen. So that is how the unidirectional data flow works over here. And now we have to some separation of concern in the UI layer. So the role of the UI layer or the presentation layer is to display the application data on the screen. We already know that whenever the data changes either due to the user interaction such as pressing a button or external input such as the network response, the UI should update and react to that particular changes. That's perfectly fine. Later we'll go and see how we can do that, right? The UI layer is made of the two things over here. The UI element that renders the data on the screen. So we'll have in Flutter we'll have the widgets and then the screens that we are going to create. You build this element using the Jetpack Compose, but we will be using the Flutter over here to create our widget, and then each of the UI element like the buttons, like the card view, and all of those are list views are all of our UI elements. And then we'll hold the states such as the view model classes. Later we'll go and create some view model, and we will hold that particular state in our view model over here. So this is how we are going to separate the UI layer with the UI element, and then the view model that holds that particular state for us. And whenever we get some data back from the domain layer and then data layer, domain layer, and then to our view model, we are going to store that particular data. And then the based on the data we have in the states, if the state changes, we are going to re-render our UI element. That is a reactive way of creating our application. If you go over here, that is of the reactive or layered architecture. So whenever our state changes, we are going to re-render our UI element over here. And we can also go and learn more about the layer architecture or the UI layer page over here. And the next one will be of the data layer. So in the data layer of the application contain your business logic, right? The business logic is what gives the value to your apps. It's made of the rules that determine how your app create, store, and changes the data. So this is the most important: create, store, and then the changes data. So all of those reside in the data layer. So in the data layer, we will create our repositories, and with these repositories, we are going to connect either to the local database or to our remote data source or the API. And this will go and handle all of your creation, storing, and changing of your data. The data layer is made of the repository that each can contain 0 or many data source, right? You can have the data source that is connected to your local database, or it is connected to the remote API. For example, you might create you should create a repository class for each different type of the data you handle in your app. So it is a best practice to create only one type of the repository based on the type of the data that you are going to handle. Like if you are handling a movie data, you should create a movie repository, or if you are handling a payment, then you should create a payment repository over here. So that is a single responsibility as well as the separation of concern that we are going to implement over here. and you can read more about the repository classes that expose the data to the rest of the app, right? So from the repository, we are going to expose, once we get the data from our data source, we are going to provide it to our repository is going to provide it to the domain layer is going to provide that data as a state back to the UI over here. So centralize the changes to the data. So the repository or the data layer that we have, repository class will be a centralized place where we will handle all of our creation, deletion, updation, getting all of the data from this particular repository class over here. Resolving the conflict between the multiple data source, if you have a different or the multiple data source over here, abstracting source data from the rest of the app, right, containing the business logic. And each data class should have the responsibility of working with only one data source. That is important thing, right? So, and which can be a file or a network resource or a local database. So data source classes are the bridge between their application and the system of the data operator. So you can just go and learn more about this in the data layer. And finally, we'll learn about the domain layer, so which is also an optional layer. You can see this is a domain layer. The domain layer is an optional layer that sits between the UI and then the data layer. So domain layer it's between the UI as well as the data layer over here. The domain layer is responsible for encapsulating the complex business logic or simple business logic that is reused by your multiple view models. So if you have something that is reusable, you should always put that in the domain layer, like your models that is going to be reused in the multiple view model, or you have some the use cases, right? Some business logic that we later will create use cases in our application. This layer is optional because not all app has this particular requirement. You should use it only when needed, for example, to handle a complexity or the favor or reusability. And let's go and see the classes in this layer are commonly called use cases or the interactors over here. We will make use of the use cases over here, and each use cases should have a responsibility over a single functionality. So single functionality basically means get all tasks, create tasks, and delete tasks, update tasks. These are the single responsibility or single functionality that use cases should have. So we should create a get all tasks use case, create tasks use case, delete tasks use case. So that is the meaning of that particular use case over here, with a single with have a responsibility of a single functionality. And you cannot create a class with multiple functionality over there. Yeah, that will break that particular the domain layer, the use cases over here. It should only have a single functionality. For example, your app could have a get time zone use case class if multiple view model rely on the time zone to display the proper message of this particular screen. So you can just go and learn more about that. And this is what we are going to use in our application, or this is the architecture or the recommended architecture or the app architecture that we'll create. And although this is related to the Android application, but since this is much more simpler to make use in our application, we'll be following this particular the architecture over here, which is of the modern app architecture. Basically, this is a layered architecture that we are going to make use in our application. So I hope you got the point. Make sure to go and read the documentation, and if you didn't understand some part of it, you can always contact me or message me in the Slack or in the Discord channel. Right, so I guess that's all for this particular lesson, and we will meet up in the next lesson. Till then, have a great day. Now let us try to understand the unidirectional data flow that we previously learned over here, but you may be a bit confused how it actually works, but let's try to simplify it in our drawing over here. So let's say we have our application over here. So let's say this is our app, and we have one button over here. So this is the one button over here, and this is of our screen, and then you have the your view model, right? So this is your, let's say, a view, and then the model over here. So this is of your view model, and then we have our data layer, and we have our, this is our let's say, okay, so let's just say this is our use case, right? So this is of our use case over here, and then you have the one more layer that will be of your repository. So this is of your repository. So repository. So that's not the good handwriting, but I guess that should be fine. So once we have our UI and a user clicks this particular button, the event will flow in this way. So this is the event. So it will go to our view model, and it will call some function over there, and that will going to trigger some function in the use case, and then that use case is going to trigger some function in our repository. And this repository, we have the API over here, right? API connection, and then we may have the local DB over here. So this may have a local DB, and that is going to call some functionality, whether to the API or whether it's going to call, depend on the how the business logic is handled in our repository. So this is the event that we have. So we have the event, so event event over here. So this is how the event flows. So user, let's say a user clicks on the button, event just is not like how the user clicks on this button, but it may even be triggered when you open this particular screen, or even may trigger when you close this particular screen, right? So that is just some kind of the example that I can provide over here. So let's say for now the user clicks on the button, so it will go to our view model and trigger some functionality change over there, and then that's going to call some functionality in our use case, and use case is going to call some functionality in the repository, and repository is the one that handles how to handle that particular data request, whether to send that request to API or to our local DB over here. And let's say we got some data back from the API over here. So we got some data back. So this is of our data data over here. So we have the data, and now this data should be passed back to our the use case over here, and then this use case will pass that data back to the view model, and view model is going to handle that as the state over here. So now once we have this, it will have a state over here, state over here. So once that state is updated, it is going to update our UI over here. So this is the state, all right, state change. So once the state change, we will update our state change is going to trigger an update update the UI over here. So once once we receive the data back from here, and it enters the view model, a view model will store it as a state, and whenever that state changes in the view model, that's going to update our UI. So this is basically a unidirectional data flow over here. So the event is flowing from the UI to the single source of truth, and data is flowing from the single source of truth back to our UI. So I hope you got the concept over here, how the unidirectional data flows over here. And that's all for this lesson, and make sure to go and read the documentation about the single source of truth over here and try to understand it more deeply. So that's all for this, and we'll meet up in the next one. Till then, have a great day.